Good evening and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dan Sutter, with the Johnson Center here at Troy University. Back in 1787, our American forefathers entered into an experiment in trying to limit government through the mechanism of a written constitution. Since then, generations of law school students have struggled to master constitutional law. Given the legalistic nature of constitutions, you might think that this is a topic that economists would have relatively little to be able to talk about. But it turns out there is an entire area of constitutional economics which is relevant both for understanding America's Constitution and our Constitution here in Alabama. To talk a little bit about constitutional economics and the Alabama's Constitution this evening, I have my colleague, Dr. George Crowley from the Johnson Center. George, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So what is constitutional economics?
Well, constitutional economics is a branch of traditional mainstream economics, which focuses on, in particular, these constraints we place on elected officials. Mainstream or traditional economics is very much concerned with how individuals, be it individual people or firms, react to and maximize their well-being subject to certain constraints, whereas constitutional economics is a lot more concerned with the actual choice and implications of the constraints themselves.
And who are some of the economists who have helped pioneer this area of constitutional analysis?
The kind of founding father, if you will, of constitutional economics is a professor by the name of James Buchanan. He basically wrote several books on constitutional economics. Others have written on it before and after.
The late Professor Buchanan, who just recently passed away earlier this year.
Right. Hayek has certainly written on these things as well, and it's again taking these tools of economic analysis and applying them to the choice of constraints on government.
Now, constitutional economics builds out of the area of public choice economics, and Professor Buchanan was also recognized as like the father of public choice economics. What exactly does public choice have to say about the level of spending that we observe by governments like, say, our modern representative democracies?
Right. Well, the fundamental kind of tenet of public choice is this concept we call methodological individualism, which is basically the idea that there is no such thing as the government absent the people that actually comprise it, so the political actors. And the best way to study the government is to actually look at the incentives facing these political actors. Once you kind of get a feel for that, and you take into account the things that motivate the elected officials and voters themselves, you have a better set of tools as far as figuring out what leads to the size of government and things of this nature. So some basic kind of concepts that play into that are things like a special interest effect, and the idea that certain well-organized but small groups have a disproportionate influence on public policy. And the fact that voters themselves have very little incentive to become truly informed about political issues.
And so how does this translate at the political level into outcomes?
Well, the special interest effect, for instance, is kind of driving this idea that these certain well-organized groups, be them a labor union or be them a group of corporations even, have this disproportionate influence because they stand to gain very concentrated benefits at the expense of a disorganized rest of us, if you will. So the public policy outcomes we tend to see that can be explained best by this type of phenomenon are things like a protective tariff, which raises the cost of goods across all consumers, but is very beneficial to those who actually are domestic manufacturers of those goods. I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Certain other things that come to mind are there's a concept we call rent seeking, which is more traditionally known in the popular lexicon as just lobbying government, which is a similar thing where we see corporations or groups of people that are actually getting disproportionate representation in the government just through simple acts of political contributions to representatives and things of this nature.
So all these incentives lead politicians to end up spending a lot of our money, and obviously we see that in the United States, but the argument is actually a little more subtle or involved in that. Not only is government spending a lot relative to what, like, say, fiscal conservatives like you or I might think it should be spending, is actually spending just too much money relative to what our average voter or average constituent of government would prefer, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, the constitutional project, or what essentially motivates the constitutional project, is this idea that we need that the median voter, or the average voter, will not be in and of themselves able to effectively constrain discretionary politicians, and that's why we need constitutional rules in place to, for lack of a better term, tie the hands of politicians and prevent them from essentially deviating from what is in the public interest.
Well, this discussion is all pretty abstract. So, can you give an example of a specific rule that economists have examined and proposed to deal with this problem?
Yeah, absolutely. So some rules that come to mind are things like a balanced budget amendment. You hear this brought up time and time again. Most states have some sort of a balanced budget amendment. They vary in stringency. But the idea would be that the government actually has to essentially balance its checkbook at the end of the year and spend only what it was able to raise in terms of revenue. Other things that come to mind are things like term limits, where politicians in Congress are only able to stand for re-election a certain number of times. We do this with the president, of course, and a lot of states do this with their governor. And then all the way down to more subtle things like an additional check and balance, where you give an executive or the president a line item veto over legislation, so that they're able to take out some of the so-called pork that tends to find its way into large bills.
So the idea there, they say the line item veto would be that a president or a governor, if they're speaking at the state level, would be able to more generally represent this general interest or the average citizen compared to legislators seeking to win re-election?
Yeah, absolutely. And perhaps more importantly, it just represents an additional check and balance, which is not something that constitutional economists came up with. I mean, this is in the writings of our founding fathers. Madison writes about making ambition being made to counteract ambition, and the idea that we need the separation of powers and government made up of different branches, where one is designed to actually curtail the power or tendency to assume power of the other branches.
And so generally then these constitutional rules are going to be some type of a constraint beyond just elections, because elections I think are an important and valuable constraint on politicians. That's why democracy is thought of highly as representing a way to help ensure that politicians reflect or represent the people they're supposed to elect. But we're going beyond this here, right?
Yes. So the electoral mechanism, as you said, is essentially designed so that our politicians are chosen to represent us, and those that don't are not reelected in the future. The constitutional rules, once are there in place to assure that their incentives are essentially aligned with the electorates once they're in power. Because while the electoral system allows us to vote poor politicians out, we're only afforded that opportunity every so many years. The constitutional rules are there to ensure that they actually behave appropriately while they're in office.
Now, one response that I, and I'm sure other public choice or constitutional economists have received, always hear in response to this, is at some level, constitutional economics represents a giving up on democracy. It was just and that was the exact title of a book that was written back in the 1990s in response to the term limits and balanced budget movements at the time. Now, you certainly learn beginning in the civics classes, and also political theorists talk about democracy as a very important part of human flourishing in a very important part of our lives, and that we can control government through the electoral process. How do we reconcile this process for trying to control politicians through elections, and then, in effect, as you suggest, tying their hands?
Sure. So at first I would disagree that it's a form of abandoning democracy. Mm-hmm. To some extent, we already have a representative democracy in place. We don't vote on things like who should be the next head of the NSA or something like this. We elect representatives that then are supposed to reflect our preferences and make those decisions for us. The constitutional rules are simply there to best align the incentives of political actors who are self-interested like all other individuals. And when you add to this the idea that voters are rationally ignorant and that they realize that the outcome of an election is very rarely dependent on their single vote, and as such don't take the time to be fully informed on the issues, the Constitution is basically there to make sure that the people that are being elected are in the best position or best able to essentially carry out the public interest. So on the one hand, we could attempt to go around and educate the entire populace so we have a well-informed electorate and make sure that we elect only truly genuine and benevolent politicians. The alternative would be to have the system we currently have and a constitution that's designed so that in the event a bad politician is elected, their power is effectively curtailed so that their incentives are aligned with that of the public.
Now, but still, there's a response that could come back and say, regardless of whatever problems that we've identified through public choice analysis, ultimately, a democratic government is of the people and supposedly for and by the people, but it's of our own making. And if you contrast that with, say, some of the things that constrain their economy, nature, there are limits to the number of resources, the amount of resources that we have. And there are, limits to our ability to convert resources into the goods and services we want. We don't have we don't have alchemy to turn lead into gold, but we can recognize that those constraints are the laws of nature that are limiting our ability to produce goods and services. By contrast, what goes on in Washington or Montgomery or other democratic capitals is entirely a product of human interactions. And so if there's anything wrong with it, again, could we not just fix this? And are we not just, at what point do we abandon the process of trying to fix this or whatever?
Yeah, so I think that's not necessarily the distinction. I think that when we talk about constitutional rules, the constitutional rules are there so that the incentives of politicians who are self-interested are best aligned with the people they're elected to represent. So while it's true that we could presumably elect just find better people to run for office, to some extent, at that point, the constitutional rules will not actually be binding because they would already be in office operating to further public welfare. Where the Constitution is ultimately needed is when our ability to actually identify good politicians or benevolent politicians and elect them breaks down, and we're not able to identify these politicians. And in that case, we need the constitutional rules to best constrain their discretionary behavior. I'll just add that it's not that this is a new idea or fundamentally un-American or anything like that. The Founding Fathers, again, were very keen on this. You could make the argument they were the first public choice economists. Mm-hmm. They were very aware of the idea that men were not angels, and that in fact, if men were angels, we wouldn't need a government in the first place. Right. So given that we have a representative democracy, the goal should be to find the institutional rules that best serve to channel those ambitions into ultimately enhancing public welfare.
And certainly limitations beyond elections were a part of our American constitutional system. I mean, the politicians, there were explicit constraints on what government was allowed to do. We have the Bill of Rights. We have other limitations on government. So it's not just that we have a system of unlimited power for the government, subject to the constraint of the leaders have to be elected periodically.
Right, and I think that's kind of a fundamental thing that a lot of people aren't aware of, is that it's one thing to view our Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, for example, as the document that sets up the way the government's supposed to look. But the way economists view it is that it's actually a set of very explicit constraints on what the government is allowed to do. And again, as you mentioned, these are things that go back to the founding of the nation. It's not that these are new calls. The types of rules that are being proposed are different, certainly. But the concept of constraining our elected officials is not a new concept.
And it's actually related to, in some in some forms to the whole idea of self-constraint to begin with. And this, here we have a picture, a drawing of Ulysses and his attempting to resist the siren's call. And to do so, if you don't remember your classical Greek here, he had his crew bind himself to the mast of his ship. And this is an analogy that is often used referred to in constitutional economics.
Right. Essentially, kind of what we can think of like the paradox of constitutionalism is that to some extent well, to a great extent, we need a government in order to provide, if nothing else, like basic defense of our rights. But at the same time, in order to provide a government with that power, it means necessarily giving up the rights, giving up certain rights. So the paradox ends up being that you need a government that's powerful enough to protect your rights, but at the same time constrained enough to not itself impose its will on those rights. So it's very much in this vein of essentially, the founders certainly were willing to give up some of their rights and put constraints on themselves as well as their elected officials in the hopes that this would actually lead to a better society.
And certainly, you know, we run into some other problems where we see that politicians have a temptation to use powers that might hurt us in the longer run. I mean, certainly, I think borrowing has been one of them. Where I think by anybody's estimate, we're certainly borrowing more than is going to be sustainable long term, especially when you add in unfunded liabilities. But that's part of what politicians have an incentive to do, right? They're looking short term.
Right. So politicians, certainly at the national scale, if we're talking about the president, they're elected every 4 years. Senators are less frequently, but we see that all politicians are basically on some kind of finite clock as far as when their next election is. So the incentive is to be short-sighted, as you mentioned. And certainly this applies to state officials as well. We have the incentive for politicians in order to get elected to kind of promise goodies to current voters, and for lack of a better term, kick the can down the road. And what this typically means is high borrowing so that we can do a lot of fancy and extravagant programs in the here and now, and push off the cost of these programs to future generations. Because from the politician's standpoint, he or she will not have to face re-election at that point.
And there's an old line that says in politics, a week is a long time. And I think that's relevant here. I think another issue that arises with constitutional economics is we are dealing with something that's a very hard thing to actually get a hand on, and that's this idea of feasibility when applied to the political sector. I think there's a great line that Milton Friedman had some years ago about the search for barking cats. That we always think that government can do more for us, but what we're ultimately looking for here is a barking cat. We like everything about a cat, except it would be great if they could bark too. But alas, that's never a possibility, and that's what we're ultimately running up against. Mm-hmm. We want to talk a little bit now about the Alabama Constitution, because this is another area that you've been studying over the last year or so here at the Johnson Center. So tell us a little bit about Alabama's Constitution and how it relates, how it is relative to the federal Constitution.
Well, first and foremost, all 50 states have their own constitution. A lot of people aren't aware of that we have a federal constitution. That's the one we hear most frequently about. But all states actually have their own constitution. And the really fascinating thing as far as from an applied economist point of view is that this constitutions vary widely. Alabama has the characteristic that it's actually got the longest written constitution in the world, and that applies to all English translations of all national constitutions. It's something on order of, I think, 370,000 words long. It has an upwards of 850 amendments currently. It is significantly different from the federal constitution, which is much, much shorter and only has roughly 27 amendments or so. Mm-hmm.
Now, the length of a constitution, how is that relevant for both whether the Constitution is fulfilling this role of limiting government and for its ability to help actually limit government?
You're right that the length of the Constitution itself is not necessarily alarming, except for the fact that it's what makes up the vast majority of the length of Alabama's Constitution are these 800 plus amendments, most of which, some on order of like 70 to 80% of which, apply to very specific cases. I'm talking specific county by county cases.
There are a couple of cases, I think, yeah.
Yeah, so we have cases here where we have constitutional amendments to our state's document, which apply to a single county. And in the case of Amendment 351 there, we're talking about raising a tax in Mobile that'll apply only to Mobile to control mosquitoes in Mobile. There's another often cited example where we're talking about allowing the Limestone County to hire someone to pick up dead animals. These are clearly issues that are important to the residents of those counties. There's no doubting that, and I don't mean to argue that they're not important. The point that what is alarming about Alabama's Constitution is that it's written in such a way that to do these purely local activities requires amendment of the state constitution. And in several cases, these actually go out to statewide votes. We just had on this past ballot something on order of like 10 purely local amendments on the ballot. So it's a real problem.
These amendments actually seem to suggest that the Alabama Constitution is blurring what in constitutional economics we make a clear distinction between legislation and then the constitutional rules, right?
Yeah, so constitutions are not meant to be terribly flexible. They're meant to be relatively predictable and constant. There's procedures to amend them, surely, because circumstances change, there's no doubt. But just the simple fact that the Constitution is only a little over 100 years old in the state of Alabama and has nearly 900 amendments indicates that this is clearly not the case. We have, even without reading how legislatively oriented the amendments are, just the sheer number of amendments indicates that we have a document that is clearly not designed to be set in stone, as it were.
And that's significant because a part of constitutional economics is to suggest that we might have a greater ability to agree on rules that are going to limit or structure government than the exact legislative outcomes. That legislation is almost always going to be highly controversial and highly partisan, but we might be able to agree on rules. So if you think of like the 13th Amendment, which the Emancipation Amendment, I mean, we might have a broader consensus for something like that than exactly what legislation is going to be passed.
And this is exactly right. And I encourage anyone that's interested in this, to just go and refresh your memory on what the amendments to the federal Constitution look like. These are very broad rules. In some cases, in the case of the Bill of Rights, they're actually additional explicit constraints on government. These are things that you cannot do. And then in other cases, they're dealing with either reworking certain procedural elements that didn't pan out in the original document, or adding additional constraints or clarifying certain rights. They are certainly not designed to pose as legislation, and even in addition to that, they're certainly not designed to apply to only one state. Whereas in Alabama, we have obviously very different notion of what an amendment to the Constitution looks like.
And Alabama's Constitution also reflects a somewhat different balance between the state and county level governments. And to some extent, if we normally think of federalism as relating to the relationship between the federal government in Washington and the states, but there can also be an extra level of federalism if you had counties that could operate under their state. But that's not really seen from what you're talking about, what we have in Alabama, right? Right.
So again, we have a case here where, by and large, the entire state is having a debate on individual county level issues. From a pure economic standpoint, we look at federalism as the optimal level of services, being at the county or being at the level where it makes more sense. Should we be collecting dead farm animals in Limestone County? Well, the people of Limestone County are probably in the best position to make that determination. Certainly, I here in Troy don't know anything about Limestone County. So the idea here that we actually are concentrating power in Montgomery and having our state legislature debate these amendments that then go out in some cases to a statewide vote is certainly contrary to that idea.
So then, what would be your advice for for constitutional reform in Alabama? Do you think it's something that's needed, and if so, in what kind of direction should we proceed?
I think that we certainly need to look at a fundamental rewriting of the entire document, whether that's through a constitutional convention or some have proposed an article by article rewriting, because that may be easier to accomplish. Either one of those would certainly, I think, move us in the right direction. Others have proposed just a simple home rule amendment that would give counties authority. I'm less inclined to think that Amendment 857 is going to do anything to fundamentally change the way we think about the Constitution here. But even that would certainly be a step in the right direction. But I do think we need to fundamentally revisit the Constitution and kind of just reimagine what it's supposed to look like and take our cue from other constitutions.
And to some extent, because we don't have more effective county level government in addition to state government, we're losing out on an important constraint on government in itself, because federalism often works as a way to help both constrain government and lead to better government as well, because if people could vote with their feet in one famous economist phrase.
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to James Buchanan, who we started the show off with, that's his fundamental point as well, is that in the absence of a constitution, we have this thing called federalism, where voters are able to choose their jurisdiction, and that serves as an effective constraint as well. When you have a centralized constitution, you lose that.
And it certainly seems that, given rational ignorance, which you mentioned earlier, that having either state legislators or voters across the state have to try to bother or concern themselves with issues that really are of no interest to them, because it is in Limestone County or Mobile County or one of the other counties where they don't live and it's not going to affect them. That just isn't a very good way for to have good decisions made, is it?
Right. I mean, to the extent that people are already uninformed about characteristics of who they're voting for president or the governor or their state legislature or anything like this, they're certainly not going to take the time to get informed about these very local and very specific types of amendments. So then the question becomes, while at the one hand you would like voters to approve these things, we're in a sense sending these things out to voters who are either going to just truly vote randomly without any knowledge of what the amendment looks like, and essentially get to make decisions on behalf of their neighbors, where they might not even have any actual role.
Well, I think in the United States we do have a tendency to sometimes try to do too much with elections, try to do too much with democracy. I think it's maybe not a coincidence that Alabama's Constitution was approved back in 1901 during the progressive era. I think when a lot of people were very enamored with the idea of a democracy and really expanding out to other levels of state oversight.
Yeah, and I think the kind of fundamental thing to come out of this is that from the economist's point of view, democracy is a wonderful way of trying to aggregate preferences, but it's certainly not perfect. And I don't think that the idea that more democracy is always better, especially when it comes to pertain to things that frankly voters aren't going to care about because they don't apply to them. It's certainly unclear what added benefit there is of allowing people to vote on something that they certainly have no interest in.
Well, thank you very much, George. It's been an enjoyable conversation. Hopefully we've been able to talk a little bit about what constitutional economics is about. Well, thank you for watching tonight, and tune in again next week for another episode of EconVersations. Thank you.